So we begin our official sessions this morning with three speakers. None of you need any introduction, certainly not among the group of us here, but I will introduce you briefly for the sake of the recording of this event. We're not live streaming because we have no idea if any of you will propagate heresies, but mostly because of the inconvenience of the time differences all over the world. But we are recording the sessions and they will become available soon after the conference. I will have three speakers this morning, one after the other with no questions in between, and then we'll have time for discussion at the end of the three. We'll begin with His Grace, Archbishop Rowan Williams, a bishop, a theologian, and a poet, who served for a decade as 104th Archbishop of Canterbury. And we know how difficult it is for anyone to spend 10 years, like Pope Francis on the throne of Rome, Patriarch Bartholomew for many years now as Archbishop of Constantinople, and Archbishop Williams. He was also Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Oxford University and Master of Magdalen College at Cambridge University. Is that how you pronounce it? Is it Magdalen? I thought only Oxford held that. Dr. Hale, University Professor of Church History in the Faculty of Protestant Theology at the University of Austria. She also served as Dean of the Department of Christian History, Art and Archaeology. She is co-editor of the Journal of Ancient Christianity. And Dr. Samuel Fernandez, who studied at the Augustinianum Patristic Institute in Rome, and who's now, for many years, a professor in the Faculty of Theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Santiago in Chile, where he has also served as dean. Archbishop.
Your Royal Holiness, dear friends and colleagues, I'm enormously privileged to be here once again at the Fun Hour, restoring and renewing a friendship with Your Royal Holiness which goes back for many years, to my great profit and grace. Thank you. Thank you for your hospitality here. And also to Father John for the superhuman efforts he has made to get us all here in good order, in good time, in spite of earthquakes and other upheavals. One of the more intriguing byways of 20th century intellectual history is the debate between Carl Schmitt and Erik Peterson about the nature of political theology. A debate arising largely from Carl Schmitt's brief, dense and adventurous book, Politische Theologie, published in 1922. Peterson, who had been close to Schmitt for a brief period, had already established himself as a scholar of classical and late antique thought. And in a couple of essays published in the 1920s, and then collected in 1935 into a brief monograph, Demonotheismus als politisches Problem, offered a sharp corrective to what he considered to be the implications of Carl Schmitt's thesis. It's understandably a text much marked by the pressures of German politics at the time, and by Peterson's uncompromising hostility to the National Socialist regime, for which Schmitt was beginning to emerge as an idiosyncratic but sophisticated intellectual apologist. The controversy ended the friendship between the two scholars. But it was not until 1970 that Schmitt, whose relationship with other ideologues of the Third Reich had not been harmonious, but whose post-war rehabilitation had been a complex and indecisive process, replied to Peterson, who had in fact died in 1960. Schmitt, in 1970, published another brief and tantalizingly compressed book entitled simply Politische Theologie 2. Now, the details of the argument, especially Schmitt's still much debated ideas, would occupy several substantial papers. But it wouldn't be unfair to summarize the focal point as a disagreement about monarchy. Schmidt's first volume had highlighted two contentious, wide-ranging statements. He said that political thinking, European political thinking, should always be understood as a secularized translation of theological categories. And he also said that the essential feature of sovereignty was the freedom to declare the exception, that is, to identify the moment when routine constitutional legality had to give way to authoritative action in the face of pressure or crisis. As we'll see, Schmidt's exposition was decisively shaped by a particular model of theological discourse, in which a late medieval and early modern preoccupation with the unlimited executive power of God, or, which came to the same thing, the untrammeled sovereign will of God, determined how the relation between creator and creation was to be understood. Peterson, who had already published a substantial monograph on how language about one God had been utilized in the Hellenistic and Roman world as a political trope to consolidate social unanimity, responded with an analysis of 4th century Trinitarian debate, which was designed to show that the orthodoxy of Nicaea decisively ruled out anything like Carl Schmitt's notion of sovereignty. While Eusebius of Caesarea, praising the actions of Constantine, had elaborated a monotheism in which a single divine creator delegated to the semi-divine Logos a governing power in the finite universe that was in turn delegated to the emperor on earth, the Creed of Nicaea and its later apologists, prominent among them in Peterson's discussion being St. Gregory the Theologian, effectively ruled out any such pattern of delegated monarchy. Christianity, says Peterson, is not a form of monotheism. Whether you understand monotheism in terms of Hebraic devotion to the one God of the covenant, or in terms of Hellenistic speculation about the transcendent metaphysical unity lying beyond the world of diverse phenomena. Schmidt's eventual reply in 1970, which is a tour de force of ingenious and often evasive rhetoric, challenged Peterson on several fronts. Peterson, says Schmidt, gave a grossly prejudiced account of Eusebius, and it argued, or rather it failed to argue, for the general illegitimacy of political theology from a very narrow base in a single historical controversy, and it oversimplified what 4th century writers like St. Gregory Nazianzen had to say about monotheism and monarchy. The impact of this debate still makes itself felt indirectly in modern theology, not least by way of Jürgen Moltmann's enthusiastic adoption in The Crucified God of Peterson's polemic against monotheism. Belief in a single sovereign deity, says Moltmann, is historically part of a deeply ambivalent intellectual strategy which sacralizes vertical patterns of authority, which overrides diversity and forecloses any kind of egalitarian exchange. From a rather different perspective, the same polemic is echoed by feminist literary scholarship, eloquently and creatively articulated by a writer like Regina Schwartz in her book The Curse of Cain. Yet, ironically, the language of monarchy has at the same time been given a new lease of theological life by way of a retrieval of the classical Eastern Christian insistence on the monarchia of the Father within the Trinity, most thoroughly and boldly argued by the late and lamented Metropolitan John Zizioulas, who, in Being as Communion, insisted that this traditional Eastern emphasis secured the absolute priority of the personal over the natural in God. God as person, wrote Metropolitan John, God as the hypostasis of the Father makes the one divine substance to be that which it is, the one God. Even Moltmann, in The Trinity and the Kingdom of God, reflects a similar view, though both he and Zizioulas are a little cautious about using the term monarchia too loosely. Vladimir Lossky, in The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, is less anxious about the term, but offers a rather different perspective from that of Zizioulas in warning about the risk of giving metaphysical priority to persons over nature. But he makes essentially the same point as Metropolitan John in resisting any suggestion that the divine life is unified in virtue of a common nature shared by the three hypostases, or that there is some kind of logically prior divine substance of which the hypostases are constituted. My necessarily very brief remarks this morning will undertake two ambitious tasks. To clarify briefly what 4th century defenders of Nicaea understood by monarchia, and why it appeared as a natural consequence of what Nicaea itself enunciated. And in the light of this, to begin to disentangle some of the crossed wires in the modern debate, suggesting some ways in which both Schmidt and Peterson radically misunderstand the 4th century sources, and asking whether there are any respects in which the crossover of theological and political themes in Trinitarian theology might still be usefully explored. After all, it's not as though questions of sovereignty, legitimacy, the rule of law, and the state of emergency are exactly academic matters these days, in a world of resurgent autocracy and pseudo-monarchical absolutism, naming no names. But let's begin with the background of Nicaea in the controversial exchanges of the immediate years before the Council. In pre-Nicene usage, monarchia is functionally equivalent to monotheism in the work of many writers. And one of the great theological anxieties of the pre-Nicene era is the multiplication of archi, of first principles. Dionysius of Rome, in his controversy with Dionysius of Alexandria, apparently notes his objection to the division of divine monarchia into different archi, different principles. And this is a commonplace criticism of Gnostic, Marcionite, and later Manichae approaches. The role in pre-Nicene theological debate of this anxiety about multiplying archi, and therefore the priority of monarchia as a theme, is deeply interwoven with the origins of the Arian controversy. Hence the significance of the opening of the Creed, quite simply, I believe in one God. Nicaea did not itself end controversy about the plurality of archi and the nature of monarchia, and you can see again in Epiphanius' Panarion 73, further polemic against the idea that there are three archi. The same point is made, of course, by Athanasius in the Thomas ad Antiochenos and in Nazianzen's Oratio 25. It's possible to read the text of Nicaea as essentially an effort to resolve problems about what it means to speak of one divine archi. And to speak of the Son, the Word as coming ektizousias to patros, out of the substance of the Father, is part of this insistence of one archi, as is the anathema against those who say that the Son is of another ousia or hypostasis than the Father. There is one and only one source, one pigi. And with that source, the Logos, the Word, is consubstantial, homoousios. Monarchia the affirmation of a single divine arche supposes an asymmetry in relation between the divine persons, but an asymmetry which is inseparable from a successivity, a continuity of action, a single undiminished continuity in divine act. Already, in the background of the Nicene formulations, especially the anathemas against belief that the Son is of another ousia, and in that phrase, ectus ousios tu patros, already we are en route to what Gregory the theologian has to say about relations of origin in the Trinitarian life. The Father is the unoriginate, aienitos, source of the Son. The Son is what that source is the source of, and so forth. So that we can speak in the Trinity of relations that are reciprocal, but not reversible. The Son is not the Father of the Father. The Father is necessarily the Father of the Son. And in that sense, this is an irreversible relation. At the same time, it is a reciprocal relation in that one cannot be what it is without the other. And part of what I believe, especially a writer like Nazianzen is trying to clarify, is this sense of a reciprocal but not reversible relation, asymmetrical but not unequal. In this sense, this is an attempt to address the misunderstanding that would reject monarchia on the grounds that dependence is diminution or inferiority, and addressing the risk of confusing what I've called reciprocity, that is a relationship which works two ways, with simple reversibility. So Nicaea most definitely addresses the question of what it means to deny that there is more than one arche in God. At the same time, it is worth noting, and not everybody does note this, I think, that the formulation, the monarchia of the Father, is not actually a commonplace in the 4th century. Monarchia tu patros is not a phrase that I find in Nazianzen, and I'd be interested to know if it can be found elsewhere. And that is, of course, a point that Nazianzen himself clarifies famously in the 3rd of the theological orations, in a passage which was very important in the Schmidt-Peterson debate. Here, in the 3rd theological oration, St. Gregory says that monarchia is not circumscribed, the verb is perigraphe, by one prosopon. Monarchia does not belong to one prosopon. Monarchia, in general metaphysical terms, refers to the fact that the entire Trinitarian life is the single arche of the finite universe. Within that single divine life there is a taxis, as we know there is an order, but to speak of the monarchia of the Father is in those terms a little awkward, and Nazianzen seems to avoid this quite deliberately in this significant passage. If monarchia belongs to the one prosopon of the Father, then, says Nazianzen in a passage which has been colossally misunderstood, first by Schmidt and then by Moltmann and by others, if monarchia belongs to the one prosopon of the Father, we end up with the classical Neoplatonic worry that a one which produces multiplicity contradicts itself. And that's exactly the phrase which Nazianzen uses. A numerically single person, productive of multiplicity, is at odds with itself. And the famous term there is stasis. There is an internal stasis in the one if it produces multiplicity. No, what is one, what is monarchical in the universe, is the active unity of the divine hypostases. the Father is the sole arche, yes indeed, but the Logos can also be called arche, again in the third oration, chapter 17, in the sense that the Trinity is ho en arche, that which is in the first principle, or meta dis arches, that which is with or after the first principle, and e arche, the arche, the first principle itself. That is what the monarchy is. It is the first principle as productive, the first principle as relational, the first principle as generative, not a single self-confined perigraptos principle, isolated in itself. The monarchia belongs to the entire Godhead, and that's why Gregory does not ascribe it simply to the Father. The Father is indeed the single arche of the Son, but the whole divine act is what constitutes the monarchia of the one Creator, because that arche is always productive, generative of the Son and the Spirit. Worth noting that the fifth theological oration, chapter 17, echoes this, where once again there is an insistence that the monarchia in question is the unity of the Trinity, quite specifically and quite explicitly. It's a unity which is expressed by Gregory the theologian in a very interesting sequence of formulations in the third theological oration, chapter 2, of which one of the most important is the ascription of tautotis kineseos, identity of motion, to the divine life, identity of motion, which is arguably a slight refinement of the language which Athanasius likes to use of the unity of action being the essential unity of the Trinity. Coming back then from this to the 20th century controversy, we can see some of the ways in which the Schmidt-Peterson controversy about monarchia runs into the ground, faced with the details of the 4th century argument. Schmidt's first argument in his original political theology tractate, drawing out the parallel between divine monarchy and human monarchy, is shown to depend on an idea of monarchy, which is indeed, as Peterson argued, alien to the 4th century categories in use. Schmidt sees monarchy as identical with individual sovereignty and with the absolute untrammeled right of a sovereign will to intrude, impose, and change as a single sovereign will. It's perfectly clear that no account of monarchia, divine monarchia in the 4th century, has anything in common with that view, which, as Schmidt himself more or less acknowledges in later life, depends far more on a late medieval and early modern notion of sovereign will, dependent partly on late medieval nominalism, refined in both political and theological contexts in the 16th and 17th centuries in relation with political accounts of sovereignty. It's a will that can interrupt a fixed process, that can overrule the law, and Schmidt notoriously compares the sovereign's right to suspend law with the divine right to work miracles. Just as in the universe, the sovereign will of God can disregard the order that the wisdom of God has created, so in politics, the quasi-divine sovereign can suspend the law in the face of crisis. Once again, this is an alien conceptual world from the 4th century, I would argue, even for Eusebius of Caesarea. On the other hand, Peterson equally seems to misunderstand what is going on. Peterson's response to Schmidt's first book is indeed a very thinly veiled critique of fascism and the Führerprinzip, and Schmidt recognized himself in Peterson's characterization of Eusebius of Caesarea as an apologist for autocracy. But Peterson completely misrepresents the argument of Nazianzen in the third theological oration by simply saying Nicene theology is opposed to monarchy. He interprets that passage from the theological oration, chapter 3, as a repudiation of the idea of monarchy. Monarchia in the theological sense and the political sense, because he, Peterson, I believe, does not see the point that Gregory the theologian is making, which is that the monarchia of God is the sole generative reality of the indivisible Trinitarian life. Schmidt's further riposte in Politische Theologie 2 absurdly misrepresents the text of Theological Oration 3.2, and I could go into detail, but I won't. And he's followed in that by Moltmann, by Peter Kozlowski, and a number of other more recent writers. And for Schmidt, this becomes part of a very, very complex argument, which I don't have time to summarize here, about how Trinitarian theology is an attempt to resolve the tension between God as creator and God as redeemer. The tension, the enmity, the word that Schmidt uses, the enmity which exists between God as creator and God as savior. Because a world which is in need of saving cannot be the same world as the world created by an absolute sovereign divinity. Therefore, divinity itself must resolve the enmity, the tension existing within divine life and within the universe. Once again, we are in a very different intellectual world here, and it is, I think, a task worth pursuing. I hope to pursue it in slightly more detail. Why exactly this bizarre theological fiction is imposed upon the Nicene and post-Nicene substructure. Both Schmidt and Peterson, in other words, fail to see what Gregory Nazianzen is doing in interpreting the Nicene faith. He is, first of all, denying any arbitrary, occasionalist or voluntarist account of divine life. Nazianzen, as a good Nicene, believes that the Trinitarian life is not the solution to a problem. God does not generate the Logos in response to the need to connect with creation. Secondly, Gregory affirms that the one transcendent source of the universe, the monarchia of the divine, cannot be reduced to the life of one individual subject, but is itself a complex, interactive life, an identity of motion, tautotis kinesios, in the phrase I've already referred to. So that there is no contradiction, no stasis, uprising within the divine unity. Following Athanasius, and arguably Dionysius of Rome also, following Athanasius, it's already clear that numerical identity is inapplicable to the unity of God. To speak of divine unity is not to speak of what is numerically one instance of something. And already, in the 4th century, therefore, there are the beginnings of that significant distinction between arithmetical and metaphysical unity, elaborated so much by later theologians, not least by Thomas Aquinas. And that direction of thinking, reconceiving the unity of God as something other than arithmetical singleness, that is certainly one of the directions in which the Nicene formula pushes Christian theology. That is the direction in which theology moves in order to read the homoousion intelligently and consistently. Yes, there is a single source of divine life. There is an asymmetry in divine life. No, there is no discontinuity or inferiority. Yes, the relations between Father, Son, and Spirit are reciprocally defining. No, they are not reversible. And no, they are not a matter of three instances of divine life held together by relation. The relation of origin, of source, is key here, and monarchy remains significant. But to wrap this up finally, and I apologize for a rather dense summary of a complex subject, to wrap this up finally, it does seem that one of the things which Nicene theology does put before us is precisely that challenge to a model of sovereign power, creative or generative power, belonging to any kind of individual, any kind of solitary agency. It challenges the idea of sovereign will as the expression of divine power. It pushes us towards a recognition that inseparable and interdependent action, identity of movement, is what we're speaking about in terms of divine unity. It insists on a dynamic, relational model of divine life, divine action, and divine power, which even now has something to say about how we might conceive sovereignty, liberty, and will in a world of resurgent tyranny and arbitrary exercise of power. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you, dear colleagues and guests, and thank you for the hospitality and for the invitation and honor to present some thoughts. And you see that I'm switching from general theological thoughts to one biblical verse and to look at a discussion about this Psalm 109, verse 3. So, here. Since the Bible is not a systematic theological work and the individual biblical books were written at different times, single verses have repeatedly provided material for heated theological disputations. This was also the case, as you all know, in the Trinitarian debate. Here some verses were repeatedly at the center of treatises, which even seem to contradict each other. So, for example, the most famous example is probably the two verses in the Gospel of John, I and the Father are one, or the Father is greater than I. But it was not only passages from the New Testament, but also from books from the Old Testament, whose interpretations were controversial. Okay. The most well-known verse was certainly Proverbs 8:22, and it was probably Emperor Constantine himself who referred to this verse in this famous letter to the opponents Arius and Alexander of Alexandria. He compared the Trinitarian dispute to a conflict between philosophical schools which resolve around only a few passages in the Bible. I quote, I understand that the present controversy began in the following way. When you, Alexander, asked the presbyters what each of them brought about a passage in the law, or rather about an unimportant part of it, you, Arius, stubbornly put forward something that no one should have begun to think, or if they do think it, should pass over in silence. Hence, discord has been sown among you. The community has been denied. The sacred people have been torn into two and detached from the harmony of the common body. I skipped the second passage. I know that you are very familiar with this letter. So even Emperor Constantine knew about the relevance of biblical verses within the debate. With skilled rhetoric, he tried to play down the dispute in order to persuade the two to settle their differences. And of course, he also threw the weight of imperial power into the debate. As is well known, this was unsuccessful. This was certainly also due to the fact that it was not just one biblical verse that was the subject of disagreement, but many. And this is precisely what I want to address in my contribution and to highlight a different biblical verse, namely Psalm 109, verse 3. And I think this is one of the biblical verses and proof text that is actually then behind writing Ectes Usia tu Patros in the Nicene Creed. From one of the earliest documents, this is the wrong direction, on the Trinitarian controversy, the letter from Arius to his bishop Alexander, it is clear that Arius asked for care in the interpretation of a few biblical passages that he found difficult. I quote, "But he begat him not in appearance, but in truth, called into existence by his own will as the unchangeable and immutable one, as a perfect creature of God, but not like one of the creatures, begotten, but not like one of the begotten beings, not as Valentinus taught that which was begotten by the Father was an emanation, nor as Mani introduced the begotten as a homoousios part of the Father, nor as Sabellius called it son of the Father, by dividing the monad, and also not as Hierarchus as light from light, a chandelier or as a torch divided into two parts." And the letter ends, "But if statements like out of him and out of the womb and out of the Father I went out and came are interpreted by some as if it were his homoousion part or an emanation, then according to their conception, the Father is composite, divisible, changeable, and a body." Arius gives here 3 biblical verses in a very aphoristic form, including Psalm 109:3, out of the womb. And what they have in common is the use of the preposition ek. Therefore, I have translated it with out of, but the native speakers may correct me what would be the better translation. These short biblical references in the letter of Arius are only understandable if the biblical verses were well known and discussed already. He only needs to quote 2 or 3 words, and everybody, or at least the addressees, knows what he is talking about. Of course, Arius does not want to alter the biblical text, but he does want to avert a possible misunderstanding. Interestingly, the term homoousios, which is so important for the Nicene Creed, also occurs here. So it seems we have arrived at a central point in the early debate after all. Arius considers it important to point out the following. The Bible actually does refer to Christ as the Son of God and to God as his Father. However, caution is advised for 2 reasons. Either one spontaneously develops false human conceptions of procreation and transfers them to God when speaking of Father and Son and describing the Son as generated out of the Father, like the human beings generate children. This is to be avoided or excluded, of course. Second, one may even come up with ideas that are more associated with Gnosticism and imagining the origin of the Son from the Father as a so-called emanation. The term homoousios would then be linked to this very idea. And exactly in this context, the work homoousios is describing the kind of ontological connection and can best be compared today with biological process of cell division. I will demonstrate it later. Having said this, I would give some remarks on this psalm in general. Psalm 109 is one of the psalms which was quoted already in the New Testament. And I do not want to give you an exegesis of the whole psalm here, but only give you a hint at the red marked. These are the New Testament quotations of the psalm verses already. And this means that the Christological interpretation was already given in the New Testament. Therefore, a reference to Christ can actually be found also in all commentaries on the Psalms, and also explains the citation of this psalm in the Trinitarian theological context. You may be more familiar with the use of verse 1 here, because it seems to express a subordination of the Son to the Father and has therefore been the subject of a debate. However, I want to deal with this psalm, verse 3. For Arius, it is self-evident that the psalm verse refers to the pre-eternal generation of the Son from the Father. And it is precisely for this reason that he expresses the reservations I mentioned already about the interpretation of this psalm verse. And perhaps one may here visualize this, what Arius is thinking, what is the danger, with a modern figuratively expression, not out of the womb, but perhaps by cell division. I excuse for this profane visualization, but perhaps this gives an image what the process of emanation may be understood like. Of course, this is the idea Arius wants to avoid, the thoughts. Well, a comparable interpretation can be found in Eusebius of Caesarea. This famous Eusebius Caesarea already dealt with this psalm in his apologetical 2-volume work Preparatio and Demonstratio Evangelica, and regarded it as well as a prophetic testimony to the pre-worldly procreation of the Son from God the Father. Of course, he also emphasizes that speaking of a womb is a metaphor here. The birth, speaking of birth generated out of the womb, is figuratively. And so he states here in one passage, of course, this is to be understood not as projection, nor by division or scission or diminution or any conceivable mode of bodily birth. And when it was said that he was born from the womb of God before the morning star, we understand it figuratively. Interestingly, this limitation or caution is reminiscent of what I have just presented you of Arius. In fact, even some of the terms are the same. One has the impression that Arius is referring here to Eusebius. Eusebius also recognizes in this psalm a relevation, of course, of David, expressed in human terms, which emphasizes Christ as the Son of God and sets him apart from the other prophets of high priest. Only Christ is the only Son of God. Interestingly, Alexander of Alexandria, although he rejects the theological ideas of Arius, was also in line of this thought. Indeed, he himself quotes this verse of the psalm for refuting Arius. This verse, Psalm 109:3, is a proof that Christ is the only begotten Son of God, begotten by God. In both of the letters we have from Alexander transmitted to us, he addresses this psalm verse. In the first passage I have here, he quotes it as a proof, of course, that Christ is not a creature, not out of nothing. And in the second passage, he quotes this psalm verse for a proof of Christ and his natural sonship of being the Son of God. I quote, "For in contrast to the sons who are not his own, he said that he was his own son, idion hyon." This is already a term we can find in Alexander, which will be later on the most famous term Athanasius is using to describe the special sonship of Christ. And then there are further quotations of the Gospel, Matthew 3:17, Psalm 2, verse 7, and by showing the authenticity of the sonship, he points out that he does not have other genuine sons besides this one. And what about, this is now on the slide, what about the passage, out of the womb I bore you before the morning star? Does it not show the natural sonship, physicae hyoteta, from the paternal delivery, which the Son has attained not by practice or diligent improvement, but by his natural peculiarity? Therefore, the Father's only begotten Son also has an unchangeable sonship. The way Alexander uses this verse of the psalm is interesting. He understands it as an excellent proof of the natural sonship of Christ, eternally begotten of the Father. Surprisingly, he does not mention the critical remarks of Arius. Either he simply ignores the reservations of him, or he sees no need to go into further detail and discuss the problem in a letter to someone outside Alexandria. In any case, he also, as Arius and Eusebius, of course, understands the procreation of the Son in a figurative way and does not assume a division of the divine essence. So perhaps one can visualize the idea of Alexander in this way. I have skipped it a little bit so to demonstrate the difference. And perhaps Alexander simply does not want to go without this excellent psalm verse. For him, a wonderful proof for the procreation of the Son from the Father. There is some more evidence that this verse of the psalm was disputed in the Arian controversy, namely in Asterius, the sophist, and Marcellus of Ankara. Asterius, you know, all of you, was born in the end of the 3rd century, came from Cappadocia and converted to Christianity. He was a sophist, and during persecution he probably sacrificed, and this was remembered and criticized again and again. He was obviously a great theological thinker who was influenced Arius and supported other Arians and was in intense discourse with them. So he defended Eusebius of Nicomedia and composed a work called Syntagmatium. Also a letter to Paulinus of Tyrus defending Eusebius of Nicomedia is known. The support for Eusebius of Nicomedia, his theological reputation, which he enjoyed even without an ecclesiastical office, and his theological significance for the Eusebians were the reason for the in-depth theological debate in which Marcellus of Ankara in particular engaged. And although little is transmitted from Asterius, only some fragments from the Syntagmatium, there is something about Psalm 109:3, namely through Marcellus. So I needn't introduce Marcellus here in this round. And so the transmission is a little more complicated because what we have of Marcellus is, of course, what we know by Eusebius. So we know what Eusebius quotes from Marcellus, and Marcellus is quoting Asterius. So it's a little bit small evidence that we have what Asterius is doing with this psalm verse. We can only think about or speculate. We have only a point of criticism. And the criticism is a little bit tricky, and there is a little bit of debate how to translate this passage. But as I understand it, well, Eusebius is criticizing Marcellus here, that Marcellus likes to add prepositions where the biblical text has no prepositions. And he is quoting this with referring to a passage where Marcellus is criticizing of Asterius of neglecting a preposition. And the preposition here is this egeneza, if it's written in the Septuagint, egeneza or ex-egeneza, so the additional ex, which is the correct biblical verse. So it's a little bit, because we do not have an exegesis of Asterius on this verse, what he made out of this preposition, and we do not have actually much text of Marcellus, what is he thinking about this psalm, besides his criticism of neglecting a preposition, we can perhaps get an idea what is hidden at. So Marcellus is criticizing Asterius here in a double aspect. Asterius is accused of altering the biblical text and of a wrong interpretation, and it is conceivable that Asterius finds in this psalm a description of the pre-worldly emergence of the Logos from God in the word begetting. So Asterius, in his two-stage Logos theory, found there probably a biblical proof for the pre-begetting of the second Logos out of the first Logos of the Father. So it's a little bit complicated, this two-stage Logos theory, and this argued with this psalm verse. And Marcellus, on the other hand, probably saw in the additional ek, which he demands, an indication that this implies a clearer separation from God, which is why the verse cannot refer to this, but must mean the incarnation, begetting out of God. So perhaps Asterius is something like this, a visualization. Now the psalm verse out of the womb stimulated me to think of modern visualizations or different visualizations. And of course, this is a picture of a halo. So perhaps the divine and a logos out of, not from the divine, but surrounding the logos, and then getting a second logos. And this is then the logos which is the logos which incarnates then. And as I indicated now, that Marcellus here introduces a new understanding of this psalm verse, that it should not refer to the pro-generation, but pre-existent generation, but to the incarnation. So it's Christmas story, actually, is told about. And in doing so, he wants to avoid the idea of a pre-worldly generation of the Son or Logos from God, which would result in a second entity, and sees a generation only as occurring in incarnation. Perhaps he wanted to support this idea with this psalm verse, including the preposition. Only the Logos incarnate is really generated out of the Father, and this suits to his differentiation between monogenes and prototokos, which Asterius identified without distinction. So we have here an interpretation of this, with this one fragment, that this psalm verse should be related, united to the story of the incarnation. And he sees evidence in the morning star. This is, of course, then with relation to the story in Matthew and so on. You have this on the slide. And perhaps then this could be illustrated in this way. So we have this concept of the Logos endiatikos and prophorikos of Marcellus, and then we have the incarnation, and Psalm verse 109:3 then is related to this here, and not to this process here. So let's continue to confuse you a little bit more. And so we have, interestingly, a different interpretation by Eusebius himself, namely in one of his later works in his psalm commentaries. And unlike the already presented interpretation in the Demonstratio Evangelica, now he himself refers Psalm 109:3 to the incarnation. And however, this seems to have happened neither in response nor in demarcation from Marcellus, but rather on the basis of other exegetical insights referring to Greek translations of the Hebrew text, so not only taking the Septuagint, but also Aquila, you have here Symmachus and the Quinta into consideration, and trying to make up his minds on the biblical text, and he detects that the Septuagint, there is one expression even missing, and so he thinks that these words, quote, mean the physical birth of oikonomia, and he believes that with these words it is meant that not from the male sperm, but that from the Holy Spirit the fleshly generation is occurred, and womb is the pregnant woman, and the Hebrew text relates more to Miriam, Maria, and Mary, so it is more correct to interpret this prime verse with relation to the incarnation. Well, since this interpretation remains fragmentary, we have only this fragment quoted in this slide, which is from the Catena transmission. It cannot be judged with certainty whether he offered an alternative interpretation in his psalm commentary as well. Only this excerpt has been handed down, which clearly refers to Psalm 109:3, to the incarnation and the virgin birth, with the support of other Greek versions. And what about Athanasius? Unlike Eusebius, Alexander's successor Athanasius does not seem to have supported this change or alternative interpretation. He follows Alexander's interpretation and uses Psalm 109:3 as a biblical proof for the correctness of the Nicene terminology. It is also interesting to note that he does not follow Marcellus in this instance, even though he adopts Marcellus' basic hermeneutic to refer certain biblical verses to the incarnation. In other cases, he follows Marcellus, but in this psalm verse, he does not. Athanasius quotes this verse in his famous treatise De Decretis Nicaeae Synodi 2 times. As stated, this verse describes the generation of the Son before incarnation, and the first passage is the proof that the Son is God's Son and not a creature, and it's one of the famous biblical proof texts to prove this. And the second quotation here is of special interest, as it occurs here in these passages where Athanasius is defending the Nicene terminology, so homoousios and ectes ousias, and is in his interpretation and explanation what ectes ousia tu potros means. He also quotes this psalm verse. So what does it mean in the bosom besides the true begetting of the Son out of the Father? So the quintessence of him I have here in the bottom of the slide, that he states, now if someone suggests that God is composite, if it emphasizes in this essence, or that he has some sort of external cloak or hides himself or has around himself something that fills his essence, or so that when we say God or call him Father, we indicate not his invisible, intangible essence, but instead something surrounding him, then they should rebuke the synod for writing that the Son of God is out of the essence of the Father, but also realize that in thinking thus they will see him in 2 ways. And he states this, so this is the final argumentation after the passage where he quotes Psalm 109, verse 3. So Athanasius is addressing a reluctance to speak of God's essence or of the Son's generation from the Father's essence. And what is meant is probably that a thought that ties in with Asterius, the person mentioned already. The Son could not come from the invisible, untangible substance of God, but if he came from the divine essence, then it must be a different substance, so to speak, surrounding God. But this is what Athanasius wants to rebuke and criticize, and sees in Psalm 109, verse 3, an excellent proof, biblical proof for this. And a side remark, Athanasius also in the Pseudo-Athanasian Psalm commentary relates this in a comparable way, and also in what we have from Athanasius on the psalm in his Epistola ad Marcellinum, he also sees in this psalm an excellent proof for the pre-existent generation of the Son. So a short summary. The aim of my lecture was to point out a biblical verse that played a certain role in the Arian controversy, but has so far hardly been the focus of research. And despite the fact, that has to be said, that already Arius alluded to it in the earliest document on the Arian controversy that has come down to us. Since this psalm was already being used in the New Testament, a Christological interpretation was obvious. At the beginning of the Arian controversy, it was apparently already a tradition of interpretation to revert this verse free to the pre-worldly generation of the Son from the Father. Otherwise, Arius would not have taken up his critical remarks about a problematic interpretation of this verse. In contrast to Arius, both Alexander and Athanasius, the two bishops of Alexandria and opponents of Arius, saw this verse as an unequivocal and undisputable proof of the pre-eternal generation of the Son of God from the Father. Another Arian, Asterius, apparently developed a new theological concept to exclude problematic ideas of procreation and emanation, the doctrine of the so-called two-stage or double logos. Here too, this psalm verse played a role which is remarkable in view of the surviving small amount of fragments we have of Asterius. Marcellus of Ankara, on the other hand, apparently tried to interpret the verse in such a way that it referred to the incarnation of the Son using his new hermeneutic strategy. Only here could one speak of generation, and the star of the morning dawn referred to the story of the Magi. Athanasius did not follow him here, although he did adopt this hermeneutic strategy for other biblical verses. Surprisingly, it was Eusebius of Caesarea in his late work, the commentary on the Psalms, who interpreted the verse in a comparable way in relation to the incarnation, namely, even though he draws on other references to support this. Of course, it could also be that the genre of commentary influenced this interpretation beyond dogmatic disputes. And surprisingly, Athanasius then follows, as I said, the earlier Eusebius and Alexander in interpreting this verse as referring to the pre-worldly generation. So thus, the exegeses are not really 100% identical with our attribution of the theological groups in the dispute. The interpretation of the psalm had apparently already taken on a firm contour in devotion that was stronger than the exegetical debates and dispute over the doctrine of Trinity. I would like to add a final question and remark here, which I put on the slide on the bottom. We have, of course, with relation to the interpretation of Scripture, the idea of multiple senses of Scripture. So there is a possibility of interpreting biblical verses in different ways and in different contexts related to the church, to salvation, to Christianity, or in a historical way. So actually, the Christian theology has the possibility to interpret biblical verses in different ways and contexts. But we have, in the context of our Trinitarian debate, always the struggle and the argumentation that one verse has to be interpreted in one way, and it's narrowing of possible acceptable interpretations. So how to unite these two perspectives, I think this is an open question, how to come to terms with these contradictory ways of interpreting Scripture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uta. And we'll continue with the third and final paper of this session. Father Samuel.
Okay, well, thank you very much, dear colleagues and friends, and thanks especially to Father John, because of this invitation. My paper deals with the meaning of the expression homoousios to patri, and its relationship with the eternal fatherhood of God. The present paper aims to study the original meaning of the expression, the Son is homoousios to patri. For this purpose, it is necessary to avoid retrospective readings of the term and to rely mainly on contemporary sources. In addition, recent scholarship has shown that the outbreak of the so-called Arian crisis revolved around pre-cosmic origin of the Son, and that there was more continuity between theological discussions in the 3rd and the 4th centuries. Consequently, to understand the original meaning of the key expression of Nicaea, it is necessary to take into account the theologies of the pre-cosmic origin of the Son and the meaning of the homoousios before the Great Council. A methodological caveat must be stated. In polemical setting, participant tends to emphasize the most controversial aspects of their adversaries' doctrines. Additionally, they often highlight the most negative consequences of these doctrines. Some of these consequences are legitimate, whereas other are polemical distortions. Such dynamics foster polarization. Therefore, in general terms, it is possible to distinguish the original doctrines of the authors, that is what the teaching of the authors are eager to support and defend explicitly. Second level, the debated deductions of the original doctrines, that is, the doctrines that are not supported by the authors but are logical deduction of the original teachings. And finally, the polemical distortions, that is, the misrepresentations of the adversary's teaching. The pre-cosmic origin of the Son. The philosophical background of this topic is given by the Middle Platonists' discussion on the Timaeus, whether its account of creation is literal or not. Therefore, what should be said about the notions before and after, when time did not exist? There are two answers. Temporal terms in the dialogue express a sequence of events, even when time was not created. The second answer is temporal terms stands for ontological relations of dependence. In Christian context, the question was, when did the Son of God came into being? For this, we are going to study some authors. Obviously, this is an outline. Hippolytus, following the steps of Justin, Athenagoras, and Theophilus, develops the two-stage logos theology. For him, the inner logos that existed ab eterno as a faculty of God, at some point when God decided to create the universe, he was begotten ante tempora, as Son. This theology was criticized by Origen, because Origen claims that we acknowledge that God is always the Father of his only begotten Son, who derives from him without beginning, not only temporal beginning, but even that which intellect alone can contemplate. That is, Origen stressed the strict eternal process of generation. For Hippolytus, the begetting is an event, a primordial event. For Origen, is an eternal process. We go on. We have here Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius analyzed the origin of the Son of God in the Demonstratio Evangelica, a work written few years before the clash between Alexander and Arius. For Eusebius, a true begetting implies the notion of before and after. Therefore, he does not accept Origen's teaching of the eternal begetting of the Son. Eusebius says, the Son did not exist without beginning with the Father. In addition, he rejects the two-stage Logos Christology. In his view, this Christology denies God's immutability and implies the coeternal existence of two unbegotten beings. Accordingly, I have now one of his texts. By his will, God became the Father of the Son. The ray coexists with light because it is something constitutive of it. Instead, the Father pre-exists with respect to the Son and exists before his birth. Because the Father is the only unbegotten. The opposition between the two verbs is evident. The antinomy of the sentence implies that for Eusebius, the Son is not constitutive of God, but comes from God's free decision of creation. Since one is unbegotten and the other is begotten, one is the Father and the other is the Son, all should confess. That is, he is not dealing with his own theory, he is dealing with something that he saw like the theology of the church. All should confess that the Father pre-exists and exists before the Son. This priority means that God is conceivable without the Son. And this priority means that fatherhood is not eternal. And then we have like a different way of showing that is this ab eterno, ante tempora, and creation, and the different proposal. Hippolytus got alone with the inner Logos, and then the Logos was begotten. For Origen, the Logos is begotten as an eternal process, and Eusebius reacted against both and proposed that the Logos was begotten in order to create, and before he was begotten, he was not. I put this in brackets. The clash between Arius and Alexander. The idea now is to reread this text in the light of the diagram that we have shown. With this context in mind, let us consider the contrast between Arius and Alexander. Arius' letter to Eusebius of Nicaea contains a narrative describing the beginning of the crisis. Arius presents Alexander's public teaching and then affirms, and given that Eusebius, your brother who is in Caesarea, Theodotus, Paulinus, Athanasius, Gregory, Aetius, and all the Eastern bishops say God exists without beginning before the Son, they became anathema. This text, this highlighted text is extremely important. In it, Arius describes in one sentence the key feature of the theological tradition that he follows. God exists without beginning before the Son. Arius did not present himself as an original thinker, but as a representative of a tradition led by Eusebius of Caesarea. In fact, Eusebius of Caesarea claimed exactly that. If we read now what the summary of Alexander's words according to Arius, we can see that almost every sentence is related to deny this priority. Always God, always Son, simultaneously Father, simultaneously Son. The Son in unbegotten manner coexists with God, always begotten, unbegotten offshot. Neither in thought nor in certain instant is God prior to the Son. That is completely the opposite of Eusebius of Caesarea. Almost every sentence denied that God exists before the Son. According to Arius, all the Eastern bishops, headed by Eusebius of Caesarea, assert that God exists before the Son. And then, strictly speaking, the original point of disagreement was not the divinity of the Son, but his co-eternity with the Father. Of course, on the level of deductions, Alexander could say, if Arius says that the Son is posterior to the Father, ergo he denies the divinity of the Son. Finally, Arius reacts against a text which is not clear, but is a text related to two-stage Christology, because eructation, emission, etc. is like something which is inside that went out. The picture is consistent with the contemporary sources. Arius said, before the Son was begotten, created, constituted, or established, he was not. He was not because he was not unbegotten. For Arius, just as for Eusebius, the fact that the Son is not unbegotten, but originated from the will of the Father, implies an atemporal priority of the Father. Arius explicitly states that before the Son was begotten, he did not exist. And then here we have the interpretation of the out of nothing. Arius says that, well, Hippolytus could say, before he was begotten, he was an inner logos. Arius would say, no, before he was begotten, he was nothing. This is the out of nothing. Instead, Alexander stressed the strict coeternity between the Father and the Son. For using the metaphor of the light and the ray in a synonymical way, instead of Eusebius, who uses the same metaphor but as antinomy. For to say that the radiance of God's glory did not exist destroys at the same time the archetype light whose radiant he is. Besides, Alexander was aware of the link between the Arian out of nothing and the atemporal priority of the Father. So, says Alexander, since the premise out of nothing is shown to be most impious, it is necessary that the Father is always Father. No? This is interesting because the out of nothing and the priority of the Father are not two different doctrines, but only one. As far as the Father is prior to the Son, that means that the Son did not exist before his begetting. The out of nothing and the atemporal priority of the Father are bounded together. In summary, the crucial point of disagreement was whether the begetting of the Son implied a sort of posteriority or not. Then, to complete this frame, we should add Marcellus and George of Laodicea. We could put also Asterius, but Uta already presented Asterius. And then we have an extreme version of this line in which the Son is just a creature. Instead, Marcellus is like the extreme way of the two-state Christology, and the Son is only Son because of the union that is, the Logos is Son because of the union with Jesus, the man that is born from Mary. Then we pass to the last part of this talk, the meaning of the homoousios. Did the Synod of Antioch 268 effectively condemn the homoousios? According to Hilary and Athanasius, a lost letter by the Homoousians affirmed that the Synod of Antioch, which deposed Paul of Samosata condemned the theological use of the homoousios. This information, however, is problematic. If the homoousios was condemned in 286, why did no author use this document to attack the controversial homoousios before 358? Well, my contention is that in the synod, the bishop asked Paul of Samosata to profess that the Logos has his own ousia, and he refused that. And then as he refused to say that the Logos has his own ousia, he was condemned. And then the bishops in 358, they deduce once again, if Paul was condemned because he did not accept that the Logos has ousia by himself, then the homoousios was condemned. Regarding Arius himself, this is one text of Basil of Ancyra. Regarding Arius, the term homoousios appears 3 times in him. The most instructive passage is found in his letter to Alexander. In it, he rejects the interpretation of 3 biblical expressions referring to the origin of the Son of God. And well, this is the same text that Uta has commented. And then Arius rejected the homoousios because of 2 reasons. One, its material connotation, and the other one is the connection with 2-stage Logos Christology, that is something in God that went out. And finally, the Synod of Antioch, 325, in the Synod of Antioch, Marcellus asked Eusebius of Caesarea whether he thought that there were 2 ousias or 1 ousia in God, and Eusebius answered 2, and then Narcissus said 3. In summary, and the last step is to say that the homoousios at the Assembly of Nicaea was what we could call the dividing line between the different bishops. No? We have this text of Eusebius of Caesarea, and also we have the text of Athanasius, in which both say that the homoousios was like the theological dividing line in the assembly. In short, Arius rejected the homoousios because of its material connotation and because of its association with the 2-stage Logos Christology. No source associates the homoousios with Sabellianism before Nicaea, and I think this is an important point because precisely after Nicaea we will have Eusebius of Caesarea accusing Eustathius of being Sabellian because of the homoousios. But before the synod, we don't have any evidence that the homoousios was associated with Sabellian theology. During Nicaea, the homoousios divided the assembly. Only after Nicaea, some bishop claimed that the homoousios implied a Sabellian theology. And then the conclusions. Now it is time to try to consolidate the result of this outline. On the one hand, this reconstruction has shown that the crucial point of disagreement that provoked the crisis, that is the theological dividing line, was the opposition between the pre-cosmic priority of the Father over the Son, defended by Eusebius, and the strict co-eternity of the Father and the Son, supported by Alexander. These were not polemical deductions, but doctrines defended by them. Not by chance, Alexander's summary of the Arian doctrine begins with the following words: I steer myself without delay, beloved, to expose to you the lack of faith of those who say, there was once when the Son of God was not, and that he who did not exist at first later came to be. That is, the summary of Alexander starts with the issue of this atemporal posteriority of the Son. Again, not by chance, the compact anathema condemns first and twice those who assert the posteriority of the Son. The canon starts, those who say there was once when he was not, or before he was begotten he was not, etc., etc., the Catholic and Apostolic Church anathemizes. On the other hand, the analysis of the sources shows that the expression homoousios was the theological dividing line between the bishops at the Assembly of Nicaea. And then my deductive proposal is whether it is possible to connect these two results. With a rather deductive approach, I think it is possible to answer in the affirmative. That is, the dividing line, on the one hand, is the posteriority or simultaneity of the Father and the Son. On the other hand, the dividing line is the homoousios or not. And then the idea is whether we can put together these two important declarations. The cause of the division in the assembly was not the divinity of the Son, the Sabellian theology, or the material character of the divine ousia. What divided the assembly was the strict eternity of the Logos Son and the term homoousios. Besides, also, although Alexander belonged to a different theological tradition than Osius and Eustathius, all of them supported both the strict coeternity of the Logos and the homoousios. In addition, although Alexander and Eusebius belonged to the same theological tradition that emphasized the subsistence of the Logos, they disagreed regarding both the strict coeternity of the Logos and the homoousios. Therefore, the strict coeternity of the Logos and the homoousios gave cohesion to the group of Osius, Eustathius, and Alexander. Their alliance has theological grounds, was not just a political alliance. Therefore, it seems plausible to understand the meaning of the homoousios in light of the debate about the strict coeternity of the Son. This rationale, therefore, indicates that the homoousios should imply the strict coeternity of the Son and the Father. Eusebius denied the strict coeternity of the Son, claiming that the Son is not connatural with and constituent of the Father. Instead, to affirm that the Son is homoousios to the Father would mean that he is connatural with and constituent of the Father. According to Eusebius, the existence of the Son depends on God's free decision to create the world. The homoousios, instead, means that God is not conceivable without his Son. The existence of the Son is not a consequence of economy. The Son does not depend on God's will, but on God's being. God did not become a Trinitarian because of the plan of creation. God is eternally Trinitarian. Besides, the homoousios should not be studied in isolation of its grammatical context. I think one of the problems is that we study the homoousios as a word from the 4th century on. We should study the expression, because the research should focus in the phrase rather than the term. In fact, the phrase, the son is homoousios to patri, is constructed with a dative, an associative dative, which implies a relationship between two distinct entities. The very structure of the expression, the son is homoousios to patri, indicates the relational character of the father and the son. Their mutual dependence. One cannot be without the other. Fatherhood and sonship belong to eternity. The homoousios to patri affirm the eternal correlativity of the father and the son. Therefore, fatherhood and sonship. The Nicaean expression stressed that the father and the son are two mutually inseparable entities. This is a very important sentence of Alexander. Two mutually inseparable entities, to use the words of Alexander. Therefore, the homoousios indicates that God can only be conceived as Father. The development of these ideas was not the work of Nicaea itself. It was articulated by later theologians, particularly the Cappadocians. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for a wonderful opening session. For sticking to your time, it gives us enough time for discussion as well. This was hardly dipping our toes in at the edge of the pool. It literally threw us into the depth of the ocean. We have at least half an hour now, and possibly more. And if it doesn't go longer, that's fine too. We can get up and stretch our legs. But half an hour at your leisure for any form of discussion you like. Make sure you press the button till you see a red light. That means the microphone's on.
Just an observation first to Samuel. One thing that was striking about your presentation was how much Eusebius departed from Origen on the question of eternal generation, which surprised me. But the other thing was that your account of homoousios to patri struck me as very similar to what Rowan was saying about the monarchia of God as being inherently Trinitarian and generative. So it seemed that there was a kind of coherence there too. And that, I mean, if you're right about the homoousios to patri, you didn't have to wait for Gregory of Nazianzus to present that. Just an observation.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, for me also it's striking how far went Eusebius of Caesarea in denying the eternal generation of the Son. In my view, the point is that the Alexandrian tradition means not to keep Origenian doctrines, but to keep Origen's methodology, theological methodology. And then when we read Origen many times says, well, this is my proposal, if there is another one, this is welcome, and so on. And then possibly in the 4th century, we had two branches. That is, Alexander kept the contents of the Trinitarian theology of Origen, and he thought that he was the faithful Origenist in the heir of the Origenian tradition in the 4th century. Instead, Pamphilus, for example, in the prologue of his Apologeticum, he insisted a lot that it is possible, true Origenian scholars can disagree with Origen, not in the method, but in the contents. And then, obviously, Eusebius, who had the books of Origen, could say the real heir of Origen is myself. And he has the courage to disagree with the master, not in the method, but in the contents. The most important difference is, I think, is that Origen understood eternal generation as an eternal and therefore present process. Instead, Eusebius understood it like a very, that is, primordial event. An event, not a process like Origen. And the second thing is, yes, I think that if we take the full sentence and not the word, because many scholars, and well, since 4th century, say homoousios means Sabellianism. But if we take the son is homoousios to patri, we are speaking about two entities which are in relationship. And this relationship is not accidental, but is a different kind of relationship and shows the relational identity of both, which is what you quoted about what Rowan Williams said.
Some observations to Ron's wonderful paper and a question to Uta's paper. The first observation is this debate is completely contaminated with the impression of two people with completely different biographies in the 20s. The impression that German monarchy failed because of the loss of sovereignty of the monarch. And the attempt of a conservative to reconstruct the idea of monarchy because of his impression of the failures of the Weimar democracy by introducing the completely different to Emperor Wilhelm. That was definitely an attempt to establish a modern monarchy with shared sovereignty. And on the other side, Erik Peterson, as someone more and more distant from the classical Protestant ideas, so completely out of certain political debates. And the impression is those two, so deeply involved in contemporary political questions, are bound to one of the, how to say, key ideas of 19th century German Protestant reconstructions of the Trinitarian debate, the question of hierarchization and the relation of unity and hierarchization, and the idea that one can reconstruct the whole debate of the 4th century as a debate of hierarchization. And that's a completely misleading idea behind all the other misleading ideas, because living together, these are all ideas of the fathers of the 4th century, which are completely away. The whole idea of neo-Nicenism as something only coined by question of hierarchization is misleading. And so it's a combination of new misleading ideas of the 20s combined with a general misleading idea of the 19th century. And that's, to a certain extent, tragic. So to say that, and to change an observation into a question, do you think that is not a completely misleading idea? And now the question to Uta, there are more verses in this wonderful psalm than this specific. And the interesting question is, sorry for obsessed by the question of the numbers of items, which are in a certain extent by your wonderful illustrations, not only at the screen but also in the room. Do you have the impression that these authors have in mind also the first verse? And this brings in the question of there is someone next to me at the throne, and it's a question of two. And is this in a certain extent, because that's also an absolutely often cited verse. And the question is, how is the relation between verse 1 and 3? That's a more as question designed question. Sorry.
We'll take them in order. Rowan first. Do you have any comments
Yeah.
in response? Or?
Well, briefly, yes. Thank you, Christoph. And perhaps I can just put in a comment on Samuel's paper as well. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. It is in part this debate a function of a very strange 19th century reading of the patristic evidence, and I'd also want to go back a little bit further to the two other elements that contribute. One is Schmidt's fascination with the Catholic restorationist political philosophies of the 19th century, where the retrieval of early modern monarchical absolutism was part of the post-French Revolution period. So he will refer to Demeter and people like that. That's an element. And of course, for Schmidt, the role played by Hobbes' Leviathan, and the way in which Hobbes uses a kind of proto-hierarchical and agonistic view of father-son relations, referring specifically to a kind of Trinitarian hinterland for his own account of political absolutism. So it's a long genealogy there, and that's why I said it would take a very long time to unpick it, but yes, absolutely right. Very briefly on the homoousia. One of the odd things to my mind about the debate around the word is this, that in the pre-300 era, when the word homoousios appears, it seems to work in two completely different, antithetical ways. And I think part of the rhetorical force of Arius's argument, and Eusebius of Nicaea and others, is to say homoousios can have really only two respectable philosophical senses, both of which are quite antithetical to theological orthodoxy. And you're quite right, I think, about Sabellianism. That's not the issue. The issue is either homoousios means members of the same class, which is the multiplication of archi, or it means elements in a composite substance. Iamblichus uses homoousios in exactly that sense. You can divide up a composite substance into its component parts. So homoousios either means, homoousios doesn't just mean absorbing multiplicity into unity in the Sabellian way. Homoousios means the wrong kind of pluralism as well. And the meros homoousion or meros homoousiou, and Arius uses both of those in the letter, that I think is, well, I argued years ago, it could be a direct allusion to the Iamblican sense of homoousios, which is all about composite substances. And taking a leaf out of Uta's book and using a scientific instance, hydrogen and oxygen are homoousios as components of water. You can break down something into its homoousios parts, its meri. So it's not it's not about Sabellianism, it's about misplaced plurality in the divine, therefore materialism, because the divine becomes divisible. So I think that's an implication of pushing back at this Sabellian reading of it.
Uta?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question, because so far as I have looked through the sources looking for further evidence for gastros and so, I find comparable what we see in the letter of Arius. So it's more an isolated verse and not discussed together with verse 1. So we have in those passages where this verse is discussed, and also Athanasius and Dedicretus and so on, they are more dealing with this verse 3, and not. We know that in the Trinitarian debate and other contexts we have the discussion of verse 1, but it's not that in one paragraph together both verses are discussed. So this is a strange observation. Of course, this is dependent on the genre of theological treatises, and it's not like in a commentary where you have to go through. So it's a little bit strange and isolated, and so it's not in the argumentation with verse 3 that arguments dealing with verse 1 are combined or connected.
It's the same as you find in discussions of the exegesis of Psalm 45, where again there are significant individual verses picked up by Origen and Athanasius, but they're never connected.
And so in a way we have a completely different picture when you look at Eusebius. There we have a commentary, although this, you know, that there's the first part is only transmitted in the catena, so we have only these fragments, and there we have an argumentation which is a little bit isolated from the Trinitarian debate, although the question, is it dealing with the incarnation or not, or pre-existence generation, is of course at stage. But he's presenting something new and differently there. And I have an additional follow-up remark to homoousios, and so I really support the idea that it's not about Sabellianism, and this was already stated very strongly by Sarah Parvis in her monarchy on Marcellus of Anchorage. She made this point very strong, because this is the debate. We cannot find this in earlier debates, and Marcellus is a theologian. He's not arguing with homoousios, and so of course it's not Sabellianism, but you labeled it materialistic, and I would going with you. What you made this point very strong. So besides the philosophical, I would also make the Gnostic background more stronger. Yeah, that's the reason why I've visualized it with a cell division, which is more aligned perhaps with this emanation concept, what this is envisaged like. And what I do not see and have evidence for what you united it with is two-stage logos theology, because those theologians we have, they do not argue or they do not defend their concept with homoousios. Or do you have evidence for this? And this is in a way lacking. So it's not a term in Marcellus. He has a special version of a two logos system. It's not a term in Asterios or in other theologians who have a two-stage logos system. I do not see they arguing with homoousios.
Yeah. Well, I think that when Arius reacted against those who say that it's an education or etc., he's speaking about something that is inside, and this is a meros, a homoousios part of the Father. And then the evidence is, so to say, indirect. But I think that the only place in which Arius had an argumentation against the homoousios is against the people who say that well, it was a reality inside God that went out, which means the two-stage Christology as Iamblichus, no, that is something, a part of something. Yeah.
I'd like to just make a comment on your final binary opposition between multiple senses of Scripture and being specific when it comes to doctrinal controversy. Yes, I thought about that some decades ago and more recently. And what struck me the more I looked at it was that there was no inconsistency between the exegetical acceptance of metaphorical and spiritual and so on meanings rather than simply straightforwardly literal meanings, and the way texts were used in doctrinal controversy. Even your text is a metaphor. Thinking about it since you posed the question, I think I would want to say that even when you have multiple senses of Scripture admitted, they are not contradictory. They are different levels of meaning or different applications or read in different contexts. When you are arguing doctrinally, you do want a specific meaning to relate to that doctrinal question so that it looks as though that's a more, this text means so-and-so. But actually, I don't think their processes of thinking about texts were divided in that sort of binary way.
Yeah, thank you for this observation. It's interesting. I agree with you. But what struck me is that, for example, this psalm verse, by the earliest evidence we have with a little more differentiated exegesis of it, is Justin and his dialogue with Trypho, and you have both that it can relate it to the incarnation, but also to the pre-eternal generation. And so, but here then in the 4th century, we have then Marcellus arguing, so it is not about the pre-eternal generation, it is about the incarnation. So it's not accepting that these psalm verses can have different meanings on different levels. So on the one hand on this, on the other hand on that, and so so this is more one-sided and exclusive. To have an argument against the theological opponent, yes. Yeah.
I think when you're getting into a doctrinal debate, you will push for a text having a precise application, a precise meaning in relation to the question you're answering. But essentially, if you look at the way they exploit texts, you will find that the background in exegesis, which has interpreted texts in different meanings, different levels, and all the rest of it, is often actually directly applied to the doctrinal argument.
So we have 3 questions in line, Louis, then Father Demetrius, and Alberto.
I have an observation for Rowan and an observation for Samuel. Towards the end of your paper, Rowan, you spoke about the emergence, especially with Gregory Nazianzen, of a sense of divine unity as not a numerical unity. And of course, I agree entirely with that. I wonder how far that needs to be differentiated in a couple of ways. There comes a point in the 4th century at which people seem to rely on a later Platonist, maybe Neo-Pythagorean, if you think that's a thing, notion of unity as prior to number, and suddenly that becomes something that you can apply to Trinitarian context. So I think Victorinus, yes, Hilary maybe, but very clearly in Basil and then in the 2 Gregories. The interesting question is not simply at what point do they pick up on that idea, but how far is a notion of a pre-numerical unity as generative something that is a distinctively Christian development or commitment? Is it? I think you might think of it as potentially there in Plotinus, but suddenly it becomes central to Christians as a very specific adaptation of that later Platonic idea. Do you agree? He says. There's a question. Samuel, I think it's really important to distinguish between a two-stage logos theory or two-stage wisdom theory and a theory of multiple logoi or wisdoms. So what you find in Asterius is the latter. Yes, of course, God has his own wisdom, but that's got nothing to do with the wisdom which becomes incarnate. And I wonder if those sorts of two wisdom theories are actually ways of avoiding commitment to a two-stage theory. That seems to me likely, but it's simply that you don't, I think, find these sort of double wisdom, double logos theories of Asterius' form really much earlier at all. So I wonder if it's intended to argue against a two-stage logos theory. So,
basically, yes, I do agree. I think that there is something about this notion of a unity that is intrinsically generative, that is distinctively Christian, and which allows Athanasius, famously, of course, to say, although the creation of the world is in no sense necessary to God, it's actually the kind of thing you might expect if God is that kind of God. And I think that is a distinctive point, because if you're a very strict Platinian, you do have an abiding problem with how nous actually gets to be there, which for the Christian theologians of the 4th century just isn't a problem. It's just not an issue. So I think that notion of, yes, the unity that is prior to number works, certainly in Nazianzen, in that way, to say, well, if that unity is as we say it is, the arche that is what it is because it is generating what is enarche and what is metadisarchis, then you have a way through the Platinian impasse.
Yeah, in few words, my point is that, for example, Theophilus and Hippolytus, they identify the internal logos with the Son. Yeah? And then an argumentation against those who say that the Son, there was once when the Son was not, is to say, well, and then you are saying that God was alogos at some point. And then as a response for that, they said, no, the rationality of God is one thing, and this is co-eternal with God. But when God freely decided to create the world, he begot, create, establish another logos, another Sophia, another, which is not the same as the rationality of God. And then I think that against the two-stage Christology, they should develop this theory of the two logoi, because to defend the fact that God is eternally rational, but only when he decided to create, he begot another logos, a personal logos, who is the Son.
Yeah, and it's interesting that that on your list, on your last slide, the one person who doesn't share this sort of strict eternality of the Son, but sides with Osius and Alexander, is Marcellus, who has a pretty clear two-stage logos theory, because he sees the alternative as completely unacceptable. But in other circumstances, very quickly, you can see he doesn't really agree with Alexander or any of the people on his own side.
Yeah, but at least all of them agree that the logos is absolutely eternal. This is the point that unites the group.
But Marcellus doesn't, because when Marcellus says that let us create is like the internal discussion of a human being with himself.
Marcellus did not believe in a substantial logos, but for him the logos was absolutely eternal. And that's why he said, I speak about logos, kyrios, and not katachristikos like Asterius and all this kind of people.
Thank you. A question for Rowan. Assuming that Trinitarian monarchy has political and ecclesiological implications. Can you tell us what these implications might be?
In 2 minutes. It's difficult to draw it out in precise ways. I have some sympathy with Moltmann in his unease about monotheism as a kind of simple translation of sovereign will and sovereign personality. And I think part of what I'm suggesting was that that notion of an absolutely concentrated sovereignty as the essence of power is one of the things which has to be challenged. Sovereignty is always relational. Sovereignty is always, in some sense, I won't say consensual because that might imply processing God, which is certainly not what I'm saying. But if our ultimate model of generativity is that process of life-giving, then, as I say, the idea of sovereign will as the ultimate factor in social and political human life has to be under question. That's what I'm saying. Not that I'm saying that Nicene Orthodoxy is democratic as opposed to anything else. It's not about that. But it's just what are the categories we're using? What are the images we're using and taking for granted in talking about power in human society? And once you extend that to God's, what you might call the self-definition of God's power in incarnation and the gift of the Spirit, then you can take that a bit further.
That's an attempt to link an observation of Lewis to the question of homoousios and the Gnostics. I have to confess that I always thought the form of criticism in the Gnostic usage is the way of production. Emanation is as a form of production, sorry for the wording, not allowed, but it's also the question of that the identity of the Son is lost in the Gnostic model to an indefinite number of wisdoms. So it's not only the modus of production, but it's also that implies that Christ is faceless. That is also a critique in the Gnostic usage. And that's a problem, I think, that we have always this numbering in, but the crucial element of all philosophical conceptions is number is late. Mm-hmm. Number is late. And the theories you have presented are theories of the 4th century expressing a general idea of Platonism. Number is the second in the process.
I have to say one final question, if that's okay, from Alberto, for this session at least, if that's okay.
Yes. One question concerning the discussion that we started between Christoph and Rowan at the beginning. I think that one of the interesting things concerning the study of Peterson and Schmidt is that we understand more than in other contexts the why, the practical why, so to say, of some questions deriving from the symbol and the rereading of Nicaea. And I was wondering how this type of practical implication can be adopted also to study the origin of the council and the debates, because sometimes I have the feeling that taking the things as they are through the sources in the closed way, we can give the impression to ourselves and rebuild an image that is not realistic, of people thinking of have nothing to do drinking a martini on Nicaea and Hilton Palace, they were debating about what to do about Symposium and how many logos can you drink in a night. And so the problem that I see is that the story of the translation of the council, the sort of translation of the symbol, can give us the idea that some automatic way of thinking are going on. For instance, always striking for me in the Latin translation of the symbol, no distinction between en and mia, but unum. Mia and, or of course it's unum. What it's about what you say about unity and generativity. And if you speak Russian, you, instead of Katolichesky, use Sabornaya, and it's evident what it means, this. And these are things that are recalling and rebuilding ideas of the power and the structure of the cosmology that are evident to the people. And for this reason, for me, it's interesting in the conference like this one, and through the hospitality of His Whole Holiness, that what he said at the beginning about the encouragement to reconciliation that comes from Asia can speak to our context today, how much this reflection about the complicated things that translated ousia with substantia, that is like hypostasis, but it's not the same, can give to us the sense that the problem is not simply a way of dialogue, but something concerning the generativity of unity that you're speaking about, Your Grace. And so I'd like to have your comments on this, and if possible, your thoughts even more than what you've done in your paper.
Very, very briefly, I do think there are some ecclesiological implications in how we talk about unity, and we are very often seduced by models of unity that are, I think, antithetical to what the theology of the 4th century is about. But mindful of what you've said about the context, I don't think the Emperor Constantine I don't think he lost any sleep at all about the idea of sovereign will. That was, that was what he was interested in. And as I think I said a few weeks ago at the conference in Rome, what's remarkable about the Nicene resolution is that Constantine seems not to have noticed that he should have been backing Eusebius much more strongly if he was interested in sovereign will, and perhaps the Holy Spirit had something to do with all this after all. But I'll leave it there for the moment because I know time is short. But thank you.
Paul, I don't want to cut you off. Briefly, a question you had.
This is for Rowan too. You drew this connection in Nazianz and of the monarchia as tautautis kinesias. Can we flesh that out a little bit? I mean, does that indicate a sort of ecstasy within the Trinity then? An ecstatic motion between the persons?
It's one of those annoying throwaway remarks that Gregory Nazianzen makes in so many of the orationes, where suddenly a formula comes up and you think, oh, yes, please say more about that. And he doesn't, because he's in full flow. I think, as I say, he's to some extent, if not echoing, at least reflecting at a couple of removes Athanasius' interest in, yes, the flow, the differentiated flow of divine life. I think that's what's in his mind. There is no breach of act between Father, Son, and Spirit, because what they do is inseparably the generation of the world, just as within their own life they are inseparably bound in the process of generation and procession that's involved there. So, yes, I haven't got the text in front of me, but there's a sequence of formulae that Nazianzen uses in that particular passage. We talk of monarchia not because of the one prosopon, but because of the inseparable connection, the identity of kinesis, and so on. It's a line or two of phrases, all of them, I think, designed to speak about interactive, dynamic productive, inseparable action.
Yeah, just very quickly to follow up on that. In Oration 25, which you referred to, yeah, so it never struck me before that he never talks about the monarchy of the Father as a phrase, but in Oration 25, he does say that the one Lord Jesus Christ is referred to as God, apart from when we're also speaking about God, in which case he's referred to as Lord. He's called God because of the divine nature, Lord because of the monarchy. So there would it be a place where monarchy doesn't seem to fit what he's doing in the third oration.
I'll come back to you on that. Look to the text, but thank you.
Well, thank you all. I mean, I could give you a round of applause. Every one of you spoke. It was fascinating, and I hope we can continue this level of debate over the next couple of days if you don't get too tired. Perhaps all of us can express our appreciation to the three speakers this morning. Very grateful.